Today on Rebuilders, we start by looking at a bit of a trend that seems to be beginning in churches in Australia. And then we head where, Mark?
Well, I think there's something happening in Australia that I think is a hopeful portent, not just for Australia, but for all the different countries represented in our listenership. There is so much tumult and chaos and crisis in the world, but actually what if in the midst of this, there is one of the great evangelistic opportunities opening up that we're going to experience in our lifetime? And how do we be attuned to that?
Excellent. It's a great episode. Let's get into it. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name's Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both?
Great, thank you. Mark, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
It's good.
I saw Christmas decorations going up
Oh, yeah.
near my street, yeah.
I was in David Jones in the city on Saturday.
A department store.
I was in a department
Do
store.
they exist?
And it is fully decked out.
Wow.
There is no mistaking
Yeah.
that
I had to
retail is ready for Christmas.
put a ban on you the other day playing Christmas music.
I wasn't playing Christmas music. I was singing it.
Yeah, none of that before the 1st of December.
Well, the
please.
thing is, Daniel, as part of my job, I'm already working on a lot of Christmas-related things. So
I just feel like
too bad.
1st of December is when I allow it
Well,
to. I refuse. My son wanted to listen to Colin Buchanan Christmas the other day. I'm like, nope, waiting till December.
yeah. Look, I'm happy to sing Christmas songs with him.
All right, well, he can go hang out with you.
Cool.
I did want to just quickly bring up on behalf of a listener, an American listener.
Yeah.
How do we feel about the incredible Australian film, The Castle?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I quite enjoy it. One of my favourite actors who is no longer with us, Bud Tingwell, who
Yes.
played the High Court judge. I always really liked Bud Tingwell.
Well, it also was a parable for sort of land rights.
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, so The Castle is a movie about a sort of classic Australian suburban working class family whose house is attempted to be taken off them for a big development, and they go to the High Court, which is like the Supreme Court if you're an American, and but it's a sort of very clever analogy to what a lot of Indigenous Australians experienced, and it's a parallel to that. So that's the background. But yeah, it's an Australian classic.
It
Absolute
is.
classic.
It is.
I remember because one of the things in it is they go on a holiday to Bonnie Doon.
Yep.
And growing up in South Australia, I didn't even know if that was a real place. I now live in Melbourne, and Bonnie Doon is a real place.
It is
It's
a
a
real
real
place.
place.
I was
Part
there,
of Lake
went through
Eildon.
there like a week ago, 2 weeks ago.
There
Great
you
place.
go.
Yeah.
Going to Bonnie Doon.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's some very quotable lines from that film.
Yeah. I did listen to a recent interview with Rob Sitch, who's the director, and he said there's a number of things that his dad, like Rob's dad, used to do that he
Incorporated into the film.
like
yeah.
the like, oh boys, you don't know how good your mum is. Like, what does he say?
What have you done with it? Like talking about
what have you done?
what's for dinner? Oh, yeah, but it's what you've done with it. It's
Anyway.
what you've done with it, love. Anyway, yes,
Well,
very
welcome
Australian.
welcome to our international listeners who have fast forwarded to this point.
yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, well, thank you for your question, listener.
Lawrence.
Lawrence, are you a fan? Has Lawrence said whether they're a fan?
I'm not sure. He doesn't state whether he is or not.
Just asked. Okay,
But
cool. Well, thanks for
he
the
did
question.
ask if we could withhold pastries chat for a little bit to talk about the castle.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair. Yeah. Well, we have just spoken about the castle, which is an Australian phenomenon, part of our cultural it's a cultural icon. Anyway, there's another thing happening locally that might be speaking to something that is greater that is occurring in our society.
And the world.
And the world. What might that be?
Well, it was interesting. I saw some research this week, which I guess was the sort of evidence of a trend that I'm noticing. And, at Rebuilders, we get lots of people sending in messages and, we have lots of different churches that, talk to us. And sort of in the background, there's been this really interesting thing. It just sort of started after the pandemic, but it seems to be growing. Is it a wave yet? No. But the phenomenon of ordinary unchurched Australians with no church background turning up sort of cold turkey to churches and coming to faith. Really interesting. So it sort of would come from people just like, I'm checking this out, to people just rocking up. And look, Australia's quite a secular place. And this is sort of quite a new phenomenon. I mean, obviously there's always people sort of rocking up and, checking things out, but the frequency has risen. And, we're getting reports from sort of country churches who have not had anyone come to faith in years, and all of a sudden baptizing multiple people and multiple people come into faith. And, I've just sort of been watching this trend in the background. I saw on Instagram, image just comes up in, they send you a million algorithms. And it was of a, former Australian rules footballer who is your classic Australian who would not go to church and, is probably his lifestyle does not align with one of following in the way of Jesus closely. And interestingly, this guy was taking a photo of him at a sort of large contemporary church. And I almost sort of fell off my chair seeing this because this is just so unusual in Australia to see. And, he basically, had his mates in the comments going, what are you doing, mate? What are you turning up at this place for? And he basically said something filled with lots of swearing. So I won't use all the swearing, which made it even more interesting that, he sort of said, the world is so beep and, everything's beeped up. And Daniel's putting these incredible beeps in, and he just said, everything's beeped. Why not just give this a go?
Interesting.
So that captures what I'm trying to speak about here, that there's almost this sense that as the sort of cultural script and promises goes off track, that there's an openness. Now, the research which sort of my ears pricked up, because often you get anecdotal evidence like I've just described, but then you see something, okay, something's happening here where it's more sort of quantitative and qualitative or whatever. You see research. So McCrindle, who did great research here in Australia, basically put a little sort of report out about trust and in institutions.
Okay.
And what it said is that basically Australia has seen a dramatic dwindling in trust, and this is happening all across the world. So this is not unique to Australia. Australians probably had a higher trust in government and big business and institutions than a lot of other Western countries.
Yeah.
But what's happened just in the last sort of year or so, whatever, that's rapidly declined. So Qantas, which is the Australian air carrier, which has long held this fond place in the Australian heart, part of our national identity. All of a sudden, we're seeing last year people turning on that institution.
Yes.
The new government, which has come in, began with quite a massive win. So we had a centre-left government, Labor government came in, which is equivalent to Labor in Britain, Labor in New Zealand, Democrats in America, came in. Big majority, but very quickly the polls are turning negative against them. So what it said is that 47% of Australians had lost their trust in the Australian government during this time period in the last 3 years. It also said a parallel decline in trust is observed in mainstream media, so 47%, and large corporations. So what's happening is that Australians are very rapidly losing trust in government, media, and large corporations.
And this is, sorry, just to interrupt, this is pretty consistent with what we've been talking about for a number of years, of that movement away from institutions and moving more into networked, smaller cells of power interacting with one another.
Totally. Yeah. Part of the story we've been telling in this. And probably a lot of people hear this and go, hey, I'm from America or wherever, of course, that makes sense. But Britain. But I think Australians have been slower on this, and we tend to be more trusting of governments and institutions. But what is fascinating, and this is what caught my attention, so none of that was new. That was very ordinary. It says Australians, however, have displayed a resurgence of trust in religious institutions, with 21% expressing faith in local churches and 19% in broader church community over the last 3 years. The resurgence of trust in religious institutions reflects a renewed quest for meaning, values, and community, offering these institutions an opportunity to engage with the evolving beliefs and needs of Australians. So what I'm talking about here is what McCrindle's research is telling us is that in our nation, the trust in institutions has gone down, But an effect of that is people are sort of looking around. Where else can I trust? And there has been a rising of trust in religious institutions. Now, some might hear these statistics there and go, well, it's still low compared to trust in governments. But for Australia, traditionally, going all the way back to European settlement, there's been a very low trust in religious institutions. Australians have often been described as having a very negative view of religion and the church. So I find it fascinating that there is this resurgence, because I think what you've seen in most sort of Western developed countries is an overarching lack of trust. So let me explain this, because I think this would be very surprising, particularly to people in the United States who has seen this overarching decline in trust in institutions, and particularly the church has been part of that. There's been so much conversations about the death of cultural Christianity, deconversion, deconstruction, all of this stuff going on, particularly since COVID and different cultural war issues and recent elections. The difference I would say between Australia and America is, I remember going 10 years ago, going into a Starbucks in Nashville. I mean, it's always trying as a Melbournean to go to a Starbucks, but going to a Starbucks and seeing that everyone was reading a Christian book, having a Bible study, or, so there was this sort of sense that there was a normative cultural Christianity, and in a sense that has gone into decline, and, trust in religious institutions has dropped. I think what the difference with Australia is that it began low.
Yes.
So there's very little trust there to begin with. But what it shows is that people are having their trust in where they usually looked for answers diminished, but they're looking to new places for answers, which is really interesting. So I think that what I like about the McCrinder report is this, that they've outlined there that there is actually an opportunity. There's an opportunity there. So I think we need to look at this in the context of, why is this happening? And, what can we learn about this? I don't want this podcast just to be an Australian reflection here. We know that most of our audience is global and the majority outside of Australia. Yep. So I think this says, though, something that is worth of note outside of just the Australian context. There is a lot of chat, because we're in a culture war, of which way are things going? Is the history going towards, we're going to be more progressive, or is the history going to be, is the future going to be more conservative? And I think that one thing that people fail to note is that there is a story being told, and the story is told in recent elections. We just had an election in New Zealand, and Jacinda Ardern's government, Labor government, she'd already quit, but Chippy Hipkins, our mate, the current or former Prime Minister who took over from Jacinda Ardern, the Labor centre-left government lost, and the Conservatives came to power. So you see results like that, and already there are op-eds going, this shows that there's a global move to the right. However, around the same time in Poland, Poland's had for some time a quite conservative government, and Donald Tusk, who's a sort of former EU politician, ran against the sort of further right Conservative Party and won. So then there was other sort of op-eds going, oh no, we're going to have there's now a pushback against this move to the right. And the question then is, well, which way is history heading? And I think the real answer is that when you look, and it's quite remarkable, there's certain websites which tell you all of the major leaders around the world and their current polling.
Yeah, okay.
And whether it's from South Korea to Japan to France to Canada to the United Kingdom to America, is almost every leader is in horrendous negative polling territory. Doesn't matter whether they're right or left wing. And I think that what this is saying is that there is a global frustration with whoever is in power. And what that's telling us is these elections, we just had in Australia, a little while ago now, a couple of months, but, a vote around Indigenous recognition in the Constitution and called The Voice. At the beginning, the polling was the majority of Australians were for this. But then by the time you got to the actual vote, it ended up being soundly defeated. And you saw about 2 months before, if you look at the polling, the government who's just come in, the new centre-left Labor government just came in on a sort of large majority. Yeah. All of a sudden, polling went against them because why? Because cost of living crisis started to hit. Interest rates went up, inflation.
Yep.
And almost the sort of fate of this poll was sealed at this point. Now, is that the only reason? No. In a massive, complex countries, there's never monocausal reasons why something gets defeated. But what happened was, I think, a really important part of our national story ended up, in a sense, getting hijacked by a protest vote. And I think that's tragic for what that vote was actually about. But it tells us something bigger that's happening in the world is the overall mood is protest. What people are seeing is, in a sense, in 2016, with elections going in different directions than we expected, Donald Trump, Brexit, various elections around the world, is we went into this sort of zone of crisis, and people saw that as something which was going to be a temporary blip on where they thought history was going. COVID, but then Ukraine war. We now have Hamas's attack on Israel, and the ongoing economic crisis, the environmental problems not going away. Like all of these, this is everything we've talked about, cascading crises, banging into each other. And I think the difference that we're seeing is we started talking about a lot of these issues a couple of years ago on this podcast when there were issues on the horizon is they're here now. And these are now entrenched. And I think I may have said it last week, you're seeing governments now moving from here's the better future we have for you of more to how do we stop the apocalypse coming?
Yes.
So I think that this is something that is driving the stories that we have been told. People are rapidly losing faith in them. That's the moment we need to be attentive to this.
So is it, like, I suppose part of what I'm hearing though is there's a story or a narrative that we've kind of existed in or seen the world by over the last couple of decades, which has largely been shaped by politics, institutions, these kind of things. You're kind of saying, right, we're seeing the erosion of that.
Yes.
And where there's new stories on the horizon, potential for new stories to be kind of reintroduced or written. Is that kind of...
Yeah. I mean, just to use American politics very quickly to tell the evolution of that story. Bill Clinton comes in and his sort of campaign sort of mantra is, devised by James Carville, his sort of Democratic strategist, was it's the economy stupid. And basically the idea was it was a centre-left party, and Clinton was sort of from that 60s baby boomer, change the world generation, but he's now like, hey, we're just going to do the economy. Like, we're just going to make your lives materially better, right? So what happened was the vision of Western Western politics brought the horizon down from changing the world to we're just going to put money in your paycheck and you'll be happy, right? People weren't happy. And then you fast forward to Barack Obama comes in, and I think he instinctively understood that people's horizons wanted to be lifted somewhat. There'd been the period where George W. Bush had gotten engaged in wars, there'd been 9/11, and his sort of mantra is, or campaign slogan is hope and yes, we can.
Yeah.
And so you have a generation coming of age, and this is probably your guys' generation of emerging where, so you can have the good economy, but also we can hope for a better world, And even if you think about that very iconic Obama campaign poster of him sort of looking upwards.
Yep.
Now, the interesting thing is that I think Obama instinctively understood and he got like quite a significant, he came out of nowhere in many ways, beat Hillary Clinton in the primaries, wins the general election. And, it captured a lot of people. A lot of people who voted Republican came across. It's quite an incredible sort of election win. But I think in some sense he released something he didn't understand.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, Obama, that was his electoral campaign. But I think Obama was very much a classic sort of technocratic manager. He's quite a cerebral guy. And his idea of what that looks like was sort of a slow move towards a better future. And he was interested in a lot of these things, but he also was a very rationalist. And but he'd unleashed a deeper desire for change in people, and particularly in an emerging generation, your guys' generation. And they were like, cool, all right, this is the direction history is now going. And he quoted, he quoted Martin Luther King's, sort of the arc of history bends towards, progress or justice or whatever. And the sort of message there was, and I think Martin Luther King had sort of taken that from, earlier sort of American philosophy and the pragmatists, I think, or whatever they were called. But that was then the story. The story was, you're going to get economically better, and as a world, we're going to get nicer, and we're going to get more just, and we can do this. There's hope. You can do this.
Yeah.
And I think there was almost, though, a sort of the vacuum in people's sense of wanting meaning, wanting hope, almost wanting a sort of theological answer through politics. That started a movement, because Obama's thing was like, we're going to do this electorally. He understood the lay of the land. But then movementally, all these different movements kick off. Well, we want more. So he raised the expectations. And then the expectations don't get met. What happens is Obama wins, and then the global financial crisis happens in 2008. He comes into a world where the economy is not getting better. In fact, the system has been shown as incredibly corrupt. So all of a sudden, he's got a crisis on his hands. These reoccurring problems of American life, of racism, is raised through a number of, high profile. The digital cell phone means that these instances of police brutality or whatever can be captured. And all of a sudden, the sort of promise of yes, we can is people are going, okay, you said you're going to do stuff about this, but it's sort of this technocratic, neoliberal, move things to a better world. So it's neoliberal with a sort of unupdated moral categories of, how do we have just raise the horizon a little bit. And then what has happened since then is the economy isn't getting better. Obama pivoted away from the Middle East and from wars, but then ISIS kick off. Terrorism comes to places like France and England and all over the world through ISIS's sort of period of attacks. And everyone's like, hang on, okay, the message is not here, but we're still going to hope. We're still going to hope.
Yeah.
And this holding on to hope, yet the reality of the world and the inability of the smart people, very much what Obama, and people like Ben Rhodes behind him was like, the smart people have taken over, we're going to make the world better. And it doesn't get better.
Yeah.
And then Trump is in many ways, I think, a symptom, not a cause, against this. It's not a blip and we were heading in a direction. Like this was the underlying stuff coming up. And then in some sense, the crises begin to happen when the public makes protest votes and then things still don't change.
Yeah.
So Trump comes in and many of the existing problems are still there. Similar things, I think, in Australia, we've had the Conservatives in for a long time and people are getting frustrated with them. And then we elect a Labor government and then hang on, inflation's still here. Because the reality is now in a connected world, we're not as able to control things in our countries.
Yes.
And the forces that we're dealing with are massive. So Australia could go completely carbon zero, but if China and Russia and the United States don't change, it's not going to affect us. So the economic of what other countries do with their currency or global trade or a pandemic coming out of another country massively affects us. So there's this sense like, hang on, we're not as in control as we thought. And the story, which is exactly what you've said, which we had imbibed, that hope, yes, you can. You're going to be economically well off. You're going to be morally part of a great thing that we're doing. It's like we have just been punched again and again. We've gotten up and we just get knocked down again. And I think we're coming to the end of a phase that began. So the 2016 was the interruption of that story, realizing like, hang on, this thing's on the skids here. I think where we are in 2023, and particularly in the US, like we're heading towards an election where the majority of the people don't want those two candidates. That's quite unusual. You've got in Britain heading to a general election where the Labor Party is, the Conservative Party is very unpopular and Labor will get in, but will Labor be able to change things? John Gray, the philosopher, said the crisis in Britain will come when Labor gets in and then people realise they're not able to change things. And so, I think what we're seeing now is it's taken some time for that story to be really questioned, but I think we're entering, and we've been talking about this for ages, but we're at the point now where I think your average punter in the street. So, report came out here in Melbourne in our local paper yesterday that unless you're earning over $110,000 a year, you can't afford to rent within 13 kilometers of the city.
Yeah.
So the ordinary person sees that and go, okay, this stuff is now affecting me. Now, people who didn't care about Syria and ISIS and, even global warming, all of a sudden when you're paying huge amounts for fuel in your car, you can't make your mortgage payments, you can't pay your rent, this is where it's kicking home. And so this is causing a crisis of faith in people. That's essentially a very long answer to what you just asked, but that's the story of how the narrative that was strong in the world is dying.
Yeah. I saw an interesting Reddit post yesterday. Someone just said, millennials endured Y2K, 9/11, 20-year wars in the Middle East, the Great Recession, a once in 100 years pandemic, a Trump presidency, and now potential second Trump presidency, where he's promised revenge and retribution, all before we turned 40. This is my last battle. After that, Zoomers can deal with whatever happens next.
I agree with all that, except Y2K, nothing happening?
I know, everyone just freaked out for nothing.
Yeah. But I think it was just an interesting sentiment of probably what a lot of people, a lot of millennials perhaps feel, in that kind of nihilist. I'm out.
Yeah. And interestingly, so in the past, like, you could cocoon was the word that they used, and
yes,
and that you can cocoon somewhat when the economy's working okay, but when significant problems exist, when the issues get economical, and particularly around things like in Australia, Australia is, we've talked about very high standard of living, and all of a sudden people are struggling with food insecurity. And that's happening all over the place. So I think, as these problems become more intractable and entrenched, you're going to see a questioning.
Yes.
Yeah.
So to come back to that McCrindle quote that you referenced, they pose and posit that this could be an evangelistic opportunity.
Yes.
So what does that look like for us as the church to be aware of and looking for people that are exploring?
Well, it's interesting. Like, okay, so I'll begin with a story to answer that. And I don't know when it was. It was in the 2000s. And I was at Flinders Street Station, which is our main station here in Melbourne. And I walked along the platform and my heart sank. And the reason was it was commuter hour, and I saw multiple people reading Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And you saw after the attacks of September 11th, the new atheist movement begin. And, Richard Dawkins, Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, all these guys became, sort of rock stars, really, intellectual rock stars. And there was this sense that, September 11th had happened, and the return of terrorism, and part of one of the initial stories then, because of the story I just told of, like, there's going to be hope, the Enlightenment, the values of the West, liberalism can get us a better world, and then hang on, we're getting attacked by guys from Afghanistan with box cutters. What are we going to blame? It's religious fundamentalism. So the answer then was, the issue of the Enlightenment was that we just need to get even less religious. So let's double down on this, So, one of the people in that mix was Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was, I think, Somalian Muslim, who, basically renounced her Muslim faith and became an atheist. And she became, particularly for that crew, as they did their talk shows and books and conferences, and I mean, they appeared at Glastonbury or some big music festival, I remember one year. She sort of became the poster child of, someone who'd come from the two-thirds world, come from Africa, and had particularly come from Islam and renounced Islam. This was evidence of, someone who's rationally, sort of come out of that world. So she was one of the sort of new atheists. But fascinatingly, in the last week, she published an article, I think it was in Unheard, and she announced she'd become a Christian. And this is really fascinating. And some of the stuff we're talking about, I'm just going to read a quote from the article. So basically she says, so what changed? She talked about being part of the new atheists and how she sort of enjoyed it and so on, and, sort of gave her fame. But she's not anymore. She's not an atheist. She said, so what has changed? Why do I call myself a Christian now? Part of the answer is global. Western civilization is under threat from three different but related forces: the resurgence of great power authoritarianism and expansionism in the forms of the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin's Russia, Secondly, the rise of global Islam, which threatens to mobilize a vast population against the West. And the viral spread of woke ideology, which is eating into the moral fiber of the next generation. We endeavour to fend off these threats with modern secular tools, military, economic, diplomatic, technological efforts to defeat, bribe, persuade, appease or surveil. And yet with every round of conflict, we find ourselves losing ground. We're either running out of money with our national debt in the tens of trillions of dollars, or we're losing our lead in the technological race with China. But we can't fight off these formidable forces unless we can answer the question, what is it that unites us? The response that God is dead seems insufficient. So too does the attempt to find solace in the rules-based international liberal order. The only credible answer, I believe, lies in our desire to uphold the legacy of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, what's fascinating is what you're seeing here is someone who's making the intellectual journey that we're talking about here. Someone who had hope in sort of the Western values, sort of in a sense jumped on board the Western story that things were going to get better through Western smarts and this liberal international order, who's realizing that it's not, that all these crises that we're talking about are too powerful, that we don't have the responses ourselves, and then turns to Christianity because they see some of the things that they value in the legacy of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And, Tom Holland's book Dominion, a lot of people, she references in it, which is a book about how so much in the West that we take for granted, even he says values of people who don't like Christianity, he even says woke has sort of Christian roots, really comes from that Judeo-Christian tradition. But this is really interesting because what it raises is a possibility that I don't think many people take seriously at this moment, but I just want to put out there. Now, I do have to just come clean, and we got some messages of people who'd set a timer for a year on my TikTok will not be around, it'll be banned in America in a year. And yep, I'll put my hand up and say I was wrong. And Daniel was one of those people who, rocked up and he's like, oh, I've got a reminder on my phone. What? And some other listeners did. Yep. But I will, we can put in the show notes, there is an article about the billionaire who's keeping TikTok on your phone. So there's been quite a significant, there's been huge momentum to destroy TikTok. And I wonder whether it's still going to happen. So it's going to happen. I just had the time frame wrong. Let me just say that. I think that, one of the predictions I'm going to put out there is that we could, to our great surprise, see a significant return or interest in Christianity, but possibly it could be of a more political or cultural variety. And so one thing that could be unexpected is the return of cultural Christianity en masse in the West.
Interesting.
Now, we've seen some of that in Central Europe, in places like Hungary and Poland and, Slovakia, places like this where as they sort of moved into this post-communist era, they didn't want to go, they saw some of the excesses and problems of liberalism. They saw capitalism had some problems as well. They didn't want to go back to Soviet sort of, control. So they sort of returned to some of their Christian roots, but possibly, this is not everyone, but possibly in a sort of cultural form as an identity. So you got lots of people sort of sprouting we're Christians versus the sort of evil degenerates in Western Europe, but we don't really go to church, And I think something like that could happen in the West. And it could happen in very surprising forms. And the fact that we have a new atheist who's headed in this direction is really interesting. Justin Brearley, who does the Unbelievable podcast, has got a new podcast on sort of, I think it's called The Rise and Fall of the New Atheism, and even Dawkins and Stephen Fry and these characters who haven't become Christians, but they sort of make concessions now that they're cultural Christians, which is really interesting. And Stephen Fry's defending the singing of hymns and all this sort of stuff, which is fascinating. So we could see that. So we need to be prepared there, just because it seems like people panicking about secularism, and I think it's still there's never going to be one thing. There's going to be multiple things. Now, later in the article, we were chatting about this before. She speaks about the fact that she started going to church, and there does seem to be some solace she's finding at a personal existential level. I'm not sure if you've got that other part of the quote there.
Yes. I discover a little more at church each Sunday, she wrote, arguing that she has found a better way to manage the challenges of existence than either Islam or unbelief had to offer. And also mentions the only credible answer, I believe, lies in our desire to uphold the legacy of Judeo-Christian tradition, which is the end of the quote that you mentioned before. But then it goes on to say, She said the legacy includes an elaborate set of ideas and institutions designed to safeguard humanity, life, freedom, and dignity.
So we don't know where her heart is at, and I don't want to judge her. And my hope is that, even if she's begun in that place of maybe just philosophical, C.S. Lewis talked about, if you read his journey, it sort of grew his faith and had different forms and took he talked about didn't believe in the afterlife when he first became a Christian, but it grew, So, that's my hope and prayer for her. But I just want to say that I think what we need to do, I think of the story, I think is it Numbers 13, where, the spies are sent out into the promised land. And, most of the spies see the giants that are in the land, which are the challenges, and the negativities. And I think particularly as we come to the end of the year and we move into 2024, I think I have this sense like 2024 is going to be nutso. Like, the US election, I mean, I just can't even wrap my head around it. We've also got the Taiwanese election, which is going to be very, very fascinating with the direction of what happens there and China's interest in Taiwan, being reunited to the mainland and so on. Real global flashpoint. We have possible, all the things we talked about, possible intensification of war in the Middle East, possible general election in Britain. There's going to be a lot of crazy stuff. We're going to have no shortage of stuff for rebuilds to talk through and narrate next year. And a lot of it, I'm just going to say now, is going to be dismaying if your hope is in that story that I outlined earlier, that we as humans can move things towards a better world in our own strength. And I think what we need to be aware of, that we're going to see increasing numbers. Is it going to be thousands? I don't know. Might it be handfuls? Yes. I don't know the scale and numbers, and I'm not predicting some revival of those who are completely, dismayed by the Western order and watch the news and then pick up a Bible. But what we're seeing is some movement. We are seeing some movement. And what I love in the McCrindle quote is the fact that it doesn't just say the church as in the church universal. What it actually says is, the resurgence of trust in religious institutions reflects a renewed quest for meaning. So we're seeing that. People are wanting values. One of the interesting things that's happened in Australia is we have, government secular schools, but then Christian schools are just growing at a rapid rate. Muslim schools, Jewish schools, because people are going, even with their faith, there's no values in society. I want values. So people are looking for values and community. Offering these institutions an opportunity to engage with the evolving belief and needs of Australians. I see this as a neighbourhood level approach. And I think again too, like one thing I get frustrated at is I think there's this element where we, talk of the church universal and do we believe in that 100%, but, as the church universal needs to do these things. Well, the church universal is the average person. Let me just tell you now, listening to this podcast, because this is the average church, it's probably 50 to 200 people, like armed with some teacups and, one service and, Ethel who plays the organ, and then there's the contemporary meeting. This is the reality of most people in church, right? Ordinary people with all the challenges and so on. But what you may get is people coming through the door who are interested in a different story. And relationally, we're equipped to this because we're on the ground, And so I think part of this as well is, yes, we've, obviously I follow the news with an eagle eye. But then also there's what's happening relationally in the web of just human connectivity. And in the webs of human connectivity, it could be as you drop your kids off at school, it could be chatting to someone on the train. There are people who are starting to question. So let's not let the story of secularism tell us that people are not interested. There's going to be increasing numbers of people who are interested. You may find yourself in an evangelistic conversation with someone. Do you want to tell the story? Did we tell the story last week about you buying beer? And the conversation that you had.
I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't think we did tell it.
Tell us the story, Daniel. This is an example of what I'm talking about.
I was out just having a pastoral meeting at a very classic Melbourne, well, not classic, but it's like a wine bar / cafe thing, having lunch there. And then I was, the guy I was catching up with headed off, and then I went to, had a craft beer fridge, and I'm an avid craft beer drinker. So I grabbed some craft beer and put it on the counter, and the guy behind the counter, maybe like 40s or 50s, kind of very directly kind of looked at me and pointed at me. He's like, "What do you do for work?" I was like, "Oh, okay, hi." And I said, "Oh, I'm a church pastor." He's like, "I knew it." And then he goes on to say, "Oh, one of the younger guys that works for me, he's a 23-year-old guy. He's just gone back to church and he's loving it." And I grew up in church, went to Catholic church when I was a boy, but haven't been for years. But something's happening, and something's going on that I haven't seen before. And I kind of went on to kind of talk about, hey, Jesus. I think people are coming back to the person of Jesus and not just a religious kind of thing. And anyway, it was a great conversation. I ended up inviting him along to church and haven't seen him yet, but who knows?
You never know.
But yeah, it was just a really out of the blue kind of interaction.
And we're hearing, I think we're trying to capture in this is we're hearing this. You know, is it a flood yet? No.
Yeah.
But are there some light sprinkles of rain? Yes. And I think what he said there is really interesting. You know, there's something happening.
Yes.
So yes, next year is going to be crazy. Yes, there's all kinds of tumults in the culture. Yes, the global situation looks fraught and tense. But also here in the midst of this, and Twitter's not going to tell you this, the news is not going to tell you this, but what that guy said, there's something happening. And the fact that a bloke in a craft, whatever, selling you craft beer who doesn't go to church recognizes that, I think we need to pay attention.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, just as, you know, the scouts went into the land and saw the giants, many people are looking at giants at the moment, and are there problems? Yep, leaders falling, church stuffing up, 100%. All that's happening. But also Jacob and Caleb go in and they see the grapes and the fruit and the potential. And they're like, yeah, let's go. So I think my encouragement as we end is be Caleb and Joshua. Look for the potential. There are plenty of giants in the land, but also God calls us to go into the land and look for the fruit and look for the flourishing in the midst of it. And I think there's just a slight hint of an atmospheric change, which is going to bear fruit. Let's be attentive to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Mark, for that. Just a heads up for our listeners that we are planning to do a few more episodes for the year, and we're going to be focusing on how to lead the church to renewal. So focusing on some practical things that we as leaders within the context of churches and probably even beyond the church can do and consider and look forward to, particularly to set up well for 2024. So we're looking forward to doing that. If you want to know anything more, sort of a behind-the-scenes chat for this episode, we have subscriber chats that we send out after each episode. So you can head to our website, rebuilders.co, and you can subscribe to our mailing list, and we'll send out the email a few days after the episode is released. So please feel free to subscribe there. But until next time, it's been a pleasure.
Yes, it has.
Yeah, good.
Indeed.